Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Richmond Hill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to participate in this debate, and I will indicate from the beginning that I support sending it to the committee. I would like to acknowledge my friend's comments with regard to our colleague from Mississauga-Cooksville, who repeatedly has brought forth private members' legislation in support of this type of approach, and I think that it is one which certainly I think most members in this House can adopt. We had another version of this, C-54, which is an act to amend the Criminal Code to make consequential amendments to the National Defence Act. It's back again. As you know, Madam Speaker, the House was prorogued, and because of that, we didn't deal with this issue, and because of that, this tough-on-crime government supposedly let it languish and has only brought it back recently. So a lot of rhetoric about tough on crime, but the reality is that when it's come to legislation, they have been very speedy in bringing it before the House. In 1976, Madam Speaker, you may recall that Parliament repealed the death penalty, and they imposed a mandatory life sentence for the offence of murder. And offenders convicted of first-degree murder were to serve life as a minimum sentence with no eligibility before 25 years. And for offenders convicted of second-degree murder, a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment was also imposed, where there was a parole eligibility somewhere between 10 and 25 years, where that could be in fact reviewed. And those serving a life sentence could only be released by parole by the National Parole Board. I point out to you, Madam Speaker, that we're all concerned about crime, and one of the things that we don't hear enough from the government on is to deal with the issue of the causes of crime. And the statistics in this country, in fact, on areas of murder have remained relatively stable since 1999. There was a spike in the 70s and early 80s, but it in fact has remained relatively the same since 1999. What we need to be dealing with is the kind of programs that deal with alcohol abuse, with drug abuse, we deal with housing issues, dealing with education, dealing with issues that really affect the development of crime. It's those social issues that ultimately are the ones that breed crime in Canada. And when we don't deal with those, when we say, well, all the solutions to crime are to throw everybody in prison, it really doesn't address the causation. And it's the causation. We know there's an old commercial about changing your oil and filter, which says you can pay me now or you can pay me later. And I would rather pay now. I'd rather pay now and deal with the causes of crime rather than having to pay the escalating costs later on down the road. And that's also could apply, Madam Speaker, to health care. Again, dealing with prevention first, a better diet, exercise, etc., rather than the extreme costs that occur later on, particularly in the areas of health care. Now, we know that the Criminal Code implicitly provides that all sentences shall be served concurrently unless a sentencing judge directs that a sentence to be served consecutively or legislation requires that they be served consecutively. For example, under Section 85.4 of the Criminal Code requires that the sentence for using a firearm in the commission of an offence shall be served consecutively to any other punishment imposed on the person for an offence arising out of the same event or series of events. And Section 83.26 mandates consecutive sentences for terrorist activities other than in the case of a life sentence, and a Section 467.14 requires consecutive sentence for organized crime offences. And one example I'd point out is when a consecutive sentence may be imposed by a sentencing judge is where the offender is already under a sentence of imprisonment. Now, it is clear that my colleague from Mississauga-Cooksville, when she had proposed, and I supported those amendments that she had brought forth when we were in government, that serving if you kill one person, and I have some statistics which I will point out to you, and you get to 25 years. If you kill two people or more, you got 25 years, but you serve them at the same time concurrently. And that obviously, in my view, sent out the wrong message. But, you know, we hear about in Canada that we're not that our statistics are alarming. Well, in fact, I will point out to you later on, Madam the Speaker, when I look at England or Ireland or New Zealand, that in fact our rates of incarceration, particularly dealing with murder, first-degree murder, are significantly higher. The issue of the inability to impose consecutive life sentences does not mean that parole ineligibility periods cannot be affected. A single parole ineligibility period for multiple murders can be increased when someone serving a life sentence receives an additional, definite sentence. In such a case, the offender is not eligible for full parole until beginning on the day in which the additional sentence was imposed. And a lot of life sentences that are imposed, Madam Speaker, not only go 25 years, they go on average 28 years. So it's not an automatic, I would point out. The large majority of homicides, over 95% in this country, over 95% are single victim. They're not multiple victims. And as I said, since 1999, the rate has remained relatively stable over that period. There was an international comparison done in 1999 as well, which again looked at Canada in terms of first-degree murder sentencing, and the average time served in other countries, including the United States. And with the exception of the U.S., offenders serving life sentences without parole, the estimated average time in Canada was about 28.4 years. So the impression out there is that, in fact, people get a good deal, and in fact, they actually do serve longer. Now, it is important, I think, however, that we send this to committee, because I think it's important that the experts come to testify, that members of Parliament have an opportunity to question and to be able to have an informed and intelligent review of this legislation. Because again, it is, as I said, Madam Speaker, affecting only a very small number. But again, we know that often it is the image out there which affects people's impression of what reality is all about. And the reality is clearly different, but again, it's that image. But in places like England and Wales, the Ministry of Justice has revealed, and this I found quite interesting, Madam Speaker, that the mean time served by mandatory lifers, that is murderers, first released from prison in 2008 on life sentences was 16 years. No change from the previous year. In Ireland, in 2004, the Minister of Justice acknowledged that imprisonment was average of 17 years. And according to New Zealand Parole Board, in fact, the average was 7 years if sentenced prior to August 1st of 1987. After that, it was about 10 years. So, in fact, we are much further along in terms of incarcerating first-degree murderers than many other states, particularly Commonwealth states in the world. I would point out to you, Madam Speaker, that when we hear of the Clifford Olson cases, when we hear of the cases of Picton, these are the ones which, of course, attract national attention. And these are the ones in which millions of dollars are spent, and then people say, now what has happened to these people? What happens to the victims? And one of the concerns that certainly we have on this side of the House is we don't want people to have to relive these tragedies every few years. So it's important that the incarceration, as I say, 25 years, but if there's more than one murder involved, I have always supported that we have consecutive terms. Now, does that mean that we have thrown away the issue of rehabilitation? Well, rehabilitation, I think, is useful in some cases. I don't know that in case of multiple murderers that really is so applicable. But, you know, we listen to people like Sharon Rosenfeld, who is the founder of Victims of Violence. And her comment, Madam Speaker, is that this bill, although it affects a small number of perpetrators, still will cause the greatest amount of fear and controversy and unrest in our judicial system and the Canadian public. It will send a message. And I guess, if nothing else, Madam Speaker, as long as we are sending a clear message, that is important. But we should never shy away from the fact that the government has a duty. It has a responsibility to deal with the real hard issues of the day, and that is the issues of the causation of crime. And that starts at a very young age. It starts in our communities. It starts in our schools. And that's where we really need to do the focus. This is, again, a small minority, and we're dealing with it now, But again, if the government were really that serious, they would have brought this legislation forth much sooner, and of course, they wouldn't have prorogued the House in the meantime. Thank you, Madam Speaker.